Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be back with you for another week. Just got back from Kansas City. Well, not just but got back from Kansas City after the women's basketball tournament, and we're gonna get into all this stuff. So today's episode, we're gonna talk a little basketball in the end of the season. We'll do some Red Rocks and moving into the postseason mode, a little stickball recap, so baseball and softball. And then we'll finish up with some talk about football, so spring camp and our last position breakdown with a look at linebackers and the secondary. So let's jump right into it. But first, let me tell you about our partners at Canyon View Credit Union. Big dreams don't just belong in your imagination. At Canyon View Credit Union, we help turn those dreams into reality. From application to celebration, we're by your side every step of the way. Because home isn't just a place, it's the people you share it with. At Canyon View Credit Union, flexible options and expert guidance help you create a home that's truly yours, the perfect place to gather and belong. Guiding you home, Canyon View Credit Union. To learn more details, visit canyonviewcu.com. All right, we're going to jump right into this one. We're going to start. Well, first, let me remind you to subscribe to our YouTube channel at Utah Checkdown. We're going to start posting more stuff there and trying to get a little bit more video content on there, try to make this a little bit more professional, right? I don't know about professional, but we're going to give people options where if you want to see my ugly mug, you can watch it on YouTube, or you can just listen like most of you have. So we'll give you some options and try to go from there. But yeah, go subscribe at YouTube at Utah Checkdown. All right. So as I said, we're going to talk basketball. I was in Kansas City for the week, I should say, for the women's basketball tournament. And, it's one of those things where I love going to the women's basketball tournament because my access there is so much greater than the men's. I love the product, but also I just get an opportunity to kind of be present, right? And Utah was expected to be a little bit better than they were. They came in as a number 8 seed, so they get that first round bye. And unfortunately, they paired up with number 9 BYU, which BYU's just had Utah's number this year, and they absolutely trounced them. So BYU wins 70-52. Utah goes on a 17-2 run to make it almost a double-digit lead at halftime. And BYU just exploded in the second half. Utah couldn't get anything done. Had Lonnie Williams who could do stuff, but that was about it. And Utah suffered. And so as a result, Utah, they came into the tournament on the bubble. And being on the bubble, you don't have a lot of flexibility. You got to get those wins that you need. Obviously, getting a win over BYU would have helped because they beat you 2 times before. They'd be a quality win for you. You go play TCU competitively, and things could have changed, and Utah is potentially an NCAA tournament team for the 5th straight year. Unfortunately for Utah, they do lose to BYU for the 3rd straight time. You can hang your heads, be frustrated. I know there's some people that are frustrated with Gavin Peterson and kind of how things have come together that way. Quite honestly, this is a young team. I think Utah, I don't want to say exceeded expectations, but they definitely didn't outperform them into totality of the season. I think when you look at it, they finished relatively on par with where many expected them to, if not just a little bit higher. But this was a team that outside of Lonnie really kind of struggled to produce consistently. They did produce throughout the season. Obviously, you get a win over TCU, early in the season. One of TCU's only 4 losses up to that point, or up into the regular season. And so, really quality win, and the team, they were able to do well, but it didn't come together. And unfortunately, Utah exits the Big 12 tournament early. And, there was a lot to be made of this glass court that the men and women are playing in Kansas City. And, it has some, just as a total side note, it has some benefits, right? And I think there's some really cool elements to it in terms of what you can do with just kind of the pregame introductions, the sponsorships, the cool graphics that you can use on the court. Unfortunately, there's, in my opinion, it wasn't maximized, right? The Big 12 decided to stick with its gray court. That first day, they didn't even have a half court line. And it did, but it was a very thin gray line. Talked to some refs there that they couldn't even see it unless you were on top of it. One ref that I talked to said that they couldn't even really see the 3-point line, so it was really tough for them to judge. And their job was to do it the best they could. But that first day, it was really rough because they couldn't really see anything. The next day, the Big 12 decided to implement white lines, white solid lines that gave you easy access to the half court line. It also gave you, a better 3-point line where the refs, the players, everybody can see, and it made things so much easier. You still had the gray court, which you have this beautiful glass court, digital court. We're just going to call it a digital court, and you don't really add any color to it. And to me, I thought it could have been fun to have some sort of elements there where you tied in the winning team, right? A winning team, the further you go into the tournament, the more of the court you take over, or some elements of that, right? Maybe the 3-point line is blue if you're BYU, or it's red if you're Utah. If you're TCU, it's purple. Whatever it is, you could have like different variations of how you adapt the court to the team that's winning. And by the end, maybe the home team, quote unquote, home team, the higher seeded team going into that championship game has a majority of that court theirs, or whatever elements that they want. There's things that you could have done to introduce that to make it a little bit better. And so it wasn't just some standard grayish court that didn't have a vibrant look. And that's where kind of I think the conference missed. They didn't get what they needed to there, and honestly, it was much slipperier than I expected. It had traction, but I think it just didn't have the same give, and so you saw a lot of women there slipping. And I'm curious to see how it holds up for the men's, but it just didn't have the same give that it needed to for women, where they are going for a pivotal moment where you're going up for a layup and suddenly your foot slides out from underneath you, and the ball goes off of you and it goes out of bounds. That happens several times. It happens, and the other team capitalized, and you move forward. So really, really frustrating situation, but that was a longer side note than I expected. But it has its elements that are cool, and I think if they can invest into this in the right way, where you can make it a little bit more sticky without causing problems for the game, I think it has an advantage, right? And I think whether that's postseason play, or a school decides to go all in on the glass court, I think it has some fun elements. I just don't think the Big 12 maximized the way that it could have, if that makes sense. So getting back to women's basketball. So the Utes women's basketball team, they're kind of in limbo right now. I would be surprised if they made it into the NCAA tournament for the 5th straight season. I think this is more headed to the women's NIT. Whether they accept that or not remains to be seen. I think that they still want to play. I think people like Lonnie White, Maddie Wilkie, obviously these players that have meant a lot to the program, they want to play as long as they can and let their career continue. But we'll see. I think the bubbles popped essentially for Utah, and they're not going to get an NCAA tournament bid. So anything else would be the women's NIT. And as such, there's a chance that if they accept, that they can host at the Huntsman Center. So curious to see how that all plays out, see what situations are available. It's still TBD. But I wanted to kind of get into a little bit of a look here with what may be on the roster for the next season. So here's a little bit of projections that I've put on there. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see this already. So this is my projections, and none of this is perfect by any means. This is a situation where it's fluid. It's going to be something where, depending on the player and kind of what's going on, their exit interviews, that kind of stuff, this may change. So to me, in the conversations that I've had and kind of what I've seen, the expectation that I have is that LA Sneed returns. She's going to be a pivotal piece to Gavin Peterson's next year's roster. She worked her way into the starting lineup and then just consistently produced. There's freshman mistakes that she needs to correct, and if you can get those fixed, everything's going to be so much better for Utah. And I think she's going to be a much improved player. But she's got so much talent. She can drive. She's got great ball handling skills. She can be a great distributor of the ball. I think if she can take that next evolution, that's going to be great. Beyond that, Ella Todd, she got injured. She was a freshman guard. We didn't get to see anything. I don't imagine that she leaves, but we'll see. I think I'm just penciling in her there just simply because we haven't seen anything, and transferring can be risky, but we'll see. Evelina Otto, she was also another freshman forward. Came in off the bench, I think showed some promise. Another player that I think if she can take the next step for the sophomore year. I think she can be a great post type player. She's got physicality. She can do really well. But I want to see her take that next step to be able to move forward. And then there's Cameron Mafua. She got injured, unfortunately, early on in the season, and so we didn't really get to see a lot of her. But I think she can be another post presence that Utah could utilize that allows them to be able to be a little bit more physical down low. I'm curious to see, if she stays, if she tries to look elsewhere. But right now, I'm penciling in her as returning simply because I think she liked her time here at Utah and things went well. Now, transfer portal, Avery Gelmstead, she's good as gone. Honestly, like I don't see a world where Utah keeps her. Her production just wasn't where Utah hoped, and she didn't get the playing time that she wanted. And so she's going to shop herself around. I know she's already had interest in other teams. um, I don't want to say it's a huge loss because it can be, right? I think she came in as a highly rated freshman, but it just didn't convert, right? And some of that was her defense. She just got lost a lot of times on the court. She couldn't find a consistent rhythm. When she did, we always joked that if she could find that first shot to fall, things were going to be great for her. But she unfortunately just couldn't get into that rhythm and wants to try that elsewhere. So we'll see what happens with her, but I'd be very, very surprised there. These other three, I'm kind of putting in a toss-up category. They could return, they could enter the transfer portal, see what's happening, but I'm curious where there is, and I haven't gotten good feedback one way or the other on where they're leaning. And so I'm putting them in the transfer portal category just because there is some considerations that they could leave. First off, Brooke Walker. She was originally tabbed as the starting guard, second year player at Utah. She definitely developed this year and had a much better season, but there was things that were kind of lacking that didn't allow her to kind of take that next step. I still think it's a confidence thing. If she can play confident and play her game, she can be really solid. But the future here is LA unless you can shift her over to the two and allow those two to play. I'm curious to see how that goes. But I don't know with her. I think she would be a good asset for Utah to be able to have, but I could also see her looking elsewhere. Then there's Kyra Evans. Honestly, like I'm leaning more that she stays. I think she developed, especially this last year, coming off of an injury the first year that she was at Utah. I think she's a really solid addition if Utah can keep her. And especially if you can move her over into the 4 spot, I think you could have a 1-2 punch with, I'll get to in a second, Riley Little. But if you can get them playing, complementary basketball, I think she can be a really solid asset for Utah. She developed really well at the end of the season. For the most part, was a really productive player in the post. Wasn't out bullied by anybody. But we'll see. Then there's Reese Ross. She's obviously spent her entire career at Utah. I think this year was much harder on her than was expected. With that said, I don't know that she's necessarily looking to go elsewhere. I think she'd be wise to stay at Utah and finish out her career, but it's tough to know. Maybe she wants to look elsewhere. Maybe she feels like she can fit somewhere else. She's going to get interest from other programs. I don't think it's going to be a major interest by any means. I mean, I think she's a solid athlete, but I don't think that she's produced at the level that has been expected of her. If she can produce and she can take that next step, Reese Ross is one of those valuable players that you need on the roster. She's a glue person. She fights. She's physical. She's going to be a great asset if you can keep her. So I think if Utah can hold on to her, that's another great asset that you can keep, but it's still just TBD. Then you've got incoming freshmen Malika Satawala, Peyton Jones, and Riley Little, all three from the state of Utah. Really solid pickups. All three produced at a really high level at their respective schools. Riley Little could be a real game changer for Utah in the post, where she could come in and be this center figure, get the length that Utah has been missing. And so I'm really curious to kind of see how she factors into it and what she can do, because I think she's a really solid asset. You got two other great guards that produced at the high school level. So really curious to see there. But that's my quick look at the 2026-27 roster projection. It's going to be fluid. I think we're not going to know many of these transfer portal decisions until after the NIT is decided. But a lot of these players are already trying to look to the future. I wouldn't be surprised if many of them entered the portal to at least test it out. But all of this could change, right? You lose some of these key pieces and you're in another rebuild and it's going to be a tough season. But I think Utah can hold on to some core pieces that help, but it'll remain to be seen. Shifting over to the men's side. Now, the men's side is a little bit interesting because this season was rough, right? We expected it to be rough. They end the season with a 10-22 record. They only won 2 Big 12 games. Look, Larry Kraskowiak only won 6 games his first season at Utah. So, like, there's been some benchmarks there. Didn't have the players that Alex Jensen needed. They still got 2 wins in Big 12 play, and most important is they were competitive in most. I think what's lost there is that despite the roster not really gelling, they remain competitive. And so there's not going to be postseason play. Don't get your expectations up. Not that I think you are, but I think this is a team that if they can get the right pieces together, I think it can work. And as it stands, here's kind of how I've got my roster projections for the next year, though it's very fluid with this team. The conversations that I've had, um, these 3 names have kind of been at the top in terms of the belief that they will stay. There's other players that will likely enter the portal or that may stay depending on the right price, depending on how Utah sees them, all that kind of stuff. So, returning, I have Lucas Langarita, which we really didn't get to see much of him until the latter part of the season. I think, there's things from him that really showcase who he can be and a great ball handler and what Utah can utilize there. But it remains to be seen kind of, what that is. And then Kendall Sanders, really a young kid that I think has a lot of upside. We'll see what happens there. And then Babacar Faye got injured before the season, and I think his injury alone really changed the projections for this team. I think his presence down low would have been a big difference for Utah. And so, what does he bring this next year, assuming that he does stay? What does that look like? I think that will be of help, but it remains to be seen. Transfer portal, there's a few of these guys that are almost good as gone. Jacob Patrick being the first there, got injured, but honestly sat on the bench the entire time. Wasn't looking to necessarily get back. It just wasn't a good fit, and so Utah's going to part ways with Jacob Patrick and move on from that experience. Then there's Terrence Brown. Now, Terrence Brown is an intriguing player because on the surface, you need a player like that that's going to score 20 points a game, that's going to be willing to go ISO against players and be the bucket scorer. But there's some drawbacks with him too, where his defense is really porous. He's not getting back and doing the things that he needs to there. And then sometimes it becomes, I don't want to even call it a selfish game, but it becomes a game where he feels like he has to put everything on his shoulders. And so then he takes it upon him when in reality, maybe there's a time when he could facilitate and it would set up a better shot. There's a lot to love about Terrence Brown. And if you can keep him for the right price and help him develop and kind of work into Alex's system, that's a really solid player. But there's going to be so many teams that look for him to be able to complement their roster that I think it's going to be a real challenge to keep him. Now, like I said, I don't know that that's a huge loss. It is because you need 20 points a night type scorer, but you can find more of those guys than not. And especially if you can get them as playing defense, I think that helps. And Alex is really intent on wanting to be a defensive minded team. Obviously, you got to score. You got to be able to have an offense. I love Alex Jensen's, offenses because it moves the ball around. It gets things moving. It's not stagnant like we've seen in years past. But at the same time, you still have to play defense. And if Utah can't play defense or a guard can't play defense, it's not going to really help. And so I'm really curious to see what happens there. The other two here, Obamate Abbey and Seydou Traore, I've heard up and down things with either one of these players in terms of what they're going to do. I think at this point, there's just the expectation is they leave. Whether that's based on Utah wanting to have a different player or they want to leave. I just think that's going to be tough to keep either one of those guys, but I wouldn't be surprised if they stayed either. So they're kind of in a toss-up category. Seydou Traore, I've heard up and down things. Obviously, there's things about his game that are really compelling, and then others where he loses the ball and it's really frustrating. And so it's just this hot and cold situation with him. Abby is young, was expected to redshirt this year, just made a lot of mistakes, just kind of got lost at times. When he was on, it was good, but it was far less on than he was. And so, it depends on what he's expecting this next year, on what will be just determined on like whether he enters the portal or not. Then there's Keanu Dawes. Keanu Dawes, for me, this is just me observing this. I think as the season developed, he kind of lost interest. I don't know if that's he didn't jive with the coaching staff. I He was frustrated with the season, whatever it may be. I don't see a situation where he stays, mostly because I don't think it jived with him. So, I think Utah would be wise to keep him if they can, but I just don't know if those pieces are there yet. So I'm really curious to see what happens there. Um, he can be a great asset for Utah, but I think there was nights where he took it off and kind of melded in, which is unfortunate because I think he's a really solid player and I think he can do much better than what he did. But for whatever reason, it just didn't work out. Incoming, I'm just going to go through these quick. You've got David Katoa, Styles Clemens, Simeon Sugarataga, Zadi Lubaki, and Finn Schott. All players that I think have tremendous upside, and I'm really curious to see how they come together for Alex Jensen. I think this is a little bit more of what Alex is trying to shoot for. And so I think you're going to have a little bit more consistency in terms of what Alex wants. But until you get those pieces together and you see who's returning or who they can get from the transfer portal, it remains a crapshoot on what this can be. So I don't want to spend too much time on that because we don't really know. We'll get into that, next year as we get into, what the season looks like. But that's kind of what I expect it to be, and kind of getting into what that shapes up to be. So that's basketball. We're kind of done partially. We'll see what happens with the women, and we'll go from there. But another team looking to go into the postseason is the Red Rocks, and it's been an up and down season for the Red Rocks. Some of that is not to their own doing. Some of that is the equipment they've been on. Iowa State and Denver, I've had many conversations talking about how bad that equipment was. There's been reports about Iowa State and kind of the frustrations and the safety concerns that their equipment posed. There was one gymnast who completely fell through the foam pits that they have and hit right into the ground. I mean, like, it's just not good. And so there was not a true emphasis at developing these programs. And so, the Red Rocks just didn't perform the way that they needed to. Now, that's not necessarily an excuse in terms of what the performance was on the floor for this team, but maybe there's some explanations where they're not performing on the best equipment. It kind of can shake your mindset, and in gymnastics, that can shape it a lot. Now, right now, the Red Rocks are 12th in the country. It has been rough for their scores, and so they haven't had a high NQS. The NQS is just kind of an average of the 9 top scores, road meets and home meets, that slate you in for postseason play. And so right now, those early meets have really forced the Red Rocks into a lower spot. Usually they're in the 4, 5, 3 somewhere category, and so it's just been a lower situation, which just essentially means they're going to be paired up with different types of teams in postseason. I'll get to that just shortly, but just recap, over the weekend, they do get a win in a tri-meet over BYU and West Virginia. They scored their second highest score of the season with the 197.650. Really solid night for the team. It was senior night, so a lot of the seniors, had their standout performances and did really well. The team as a whole had 3 events where they scored a 49.5, but then had some struggles on beam and kind of dropped it. They were on pace for a 198, which would have been tremendous for their NQS, especially for a home meet. That's their last home meet, so they don't get that opportunity. But, it is what it is, and that's where the Red Rocks are going to have to fall. They've got one last regular season meet this week against UCLA on Saturday. This has been their rival forever. And so this is going to be a really fascinating meet. UCLA is one of those teams that's going to compete for a national title this year. And this serves as an opportunity for the Red Rocks to really get moving and compete and put pressure on themselves before you go into Big 12 tournament, or the Big 12 championship, and then going into regionals. And the way it shapes out for regionals right now, assuming that everything stays the same, Utah would be expected to go to the Corvallis regional. And this is going to be probably one of the toughest regionals in the country, just based on the teams that are going to be there. So right now you've got number 4 Alabama, number 5 UCLA, so you'd see them again in a couple weeks. Utah, which would be the 12 seed, and then number 13 is Minnesota. Now, the Red Rocks are more than capable of coming out of this regional and getting back to nationals, but this is the first year where, at least in recent memory, where this is going to be a real struggle to get out. The assumption is that Utah and, let's say, UCLA or Alabama can get out, but it just depends on the night, right? Like, this team has shown that they can put together a full consistent night, but if they have any slip ups on one event, you suddenly fall back and now you're at the mercy of these other teams. So really curious to see what happens. Outside of UCLA, Utah has the second highest top score of the season. So, for example, Alabama hasn't scored a 198 this year, but they are a number 4 team, and that's because they've been consistently performing. So they're consistent, but they just haven't had that top score that UCLA has had and that Utah has had. Minnesota hasn't scored anything higher than a 197.7. So that's not to say that they can't be in contention to get out of that regional, but that's what it is. So really curious to see what happens there. That's going to put a lot of pressure on the program. They've been to every single nationals since the nationals have been around, and so there's a lot of questions on, is this the first year that the Red Rocks don't get there? I don't think this is an indictment on Carly Dockendorf if they don't, but I understand the frustrations that people have if they don't get there. Right? I think it was just a rough season that way. It's tough when you're dealing with kind of literally the mental side of the sport, where their gymnastics, they know how to do it, but it's more just kind of locking in and remaining involved in that, especially with a young team, especially with moving around certain players that way that are going to make it a challenge. So, we'll see what happens. Now let's close out this before we go to football with a little stickball, and stickball meaning baseball, softball, little fun, right? Baseball. They opened up their new stadium over the weekend, and they get a 4-game sweep over Grand Canyon. So really cool opportunity to be able to, one, play in your own venue for the first time, and then you get a sweep over Grand Canyon. So really solid effort from the baseball team. They're 9-5 overall right now on a 5-game win streak. During that 4-game run or 4-game series, they only allowed 2 runs. So really solid effort. The bats were hitting, they were cracking, getting what they needed to. But then the defensive side of things, so the pitching and the fielding was really solid to only allow 2 runs. So really curious to see how they do this year. This week, they open up with Arizona to start Big 12 play. That's going to be a tough slate, but Friday night will be the first chance to be able to see that. So really looking forward to that. I'm hoping to get there this week if I can. Last week I couldn't get there, obviously, because I was in Kansas City, but hoping I can get there this week to kind of check it out. Looking forward to it. I've taken a tour of the facility, and it's pretty spectacular. So curious to see how that translates to results on the field, but so far so good. Then there's softball. The softball team has been on a tear recently. They have a 21-5 record. They've won 11 straight. They recently just swept Arizona State on the road. Arizona State was ranked at number 21, I believe. Really solid effort from this team, especially coming off a year that was a little bit more of a down year. This Utah team is much more back to what they were the last couple of years, where potentially contending for an NCAA tournament run, being in that. If you remember a couple of years ago, that was an extremely fun experience for this softball team to be able to be there, be able to compete, to host regionals. It was a fun experience. And so far, so good for that team. They do have a 3-game series at home against Abilene Christian. So check them out as well. They got ranked number 25 in Softball America's Top 25 this week. So you do now have a ranked team for softball, and, the baseball and softball is good in Utah right now. All right, let's shift over to football. First off, spring camp is going to start on March 19th. So you're going to get some of these things coming out here soon. Next week, we'll kind of preview some storylines going into spring camp, kind of check in on what's expected. That same day, March 19th, is also going to be Utah's Pro Day. So, we'll kind of lean in on some of that and see kind of what Utah's, players are going to be competing and performing. I don't know. I guess what do you want to say there? It's underwear Olympics. But we'll kind of preview that stuff next week. But like I said, spring camp will start next. What is that? Friday, March 19th, whatever day that is, March 19th. Before that, we're going to have a special event with the media and Morgan Scally. So really curious to see what I can tell about that after. I'm not really sure yet on what details I can give to that, or if some of that will be more off the record type stuff. But the point being, we are going to get more involvement with Morgan Scally and the coaching staff. The expectation is that we'll get more access during spring camp and potentially fall camp as well. What that means remains to be seen, but I think, you're already seeing a little bit more of an open football program, even if it's just releasing the rosters over social media or giving different inside looks on YouTube. There's been a lot more openness toward what this program can be, and I'm excited for the fans more than anybody to be able to have that opportunity to be able to see what's going on in the program. As a journalist, my job is not to just go there and watch games. That's fun. Don't get me wrong. But my job is to kind of be the conduit for you as a fan, to give you the inside information, to give you the access that you need. Unfortunately, in years past, Utah just really didn't want to give as much access. There was a time when Utah did, but that quickly changed. And so that hurts you as the fan, the ones that are investing the money into this and wanting to be able to be involved. My job is so much easier when I can get that access to relay that to you. I'm still going to go try to get inside information, but it's much easier when you have a coaching staff that understands their connection with the fan base and what that can mean. So really curious to see what happens there and what we get to see, what that means for you as a fan. But I think it's going to be a good change, and I'm really looking forward to that. So let's go into our position breakdowns. If you remember, we've gone through all the offense. We've gone through the defense first half. So the defensive line, we're going to finish the position breakdowns now with linebackers and your secondary. So, your corners, nickels, safety, and we'll get into that. So we're going to start with the linebackers. And as just a reminder, we're looking at who are the expected potential starters, who are your backups, maybe your deep backups, the guys that are going to need a little bit. And we'll try to break down some of this stuff. So let me switch over to this. Got to switch that. Let's start with Jonathan Hall. Jono Hall is, tabbed to be a starter at linebacker. There's potential that Utah will, go with 2 linebackers this year. There's times where Utah utilized 3 linebackers. Just depends on what it is. I think we're going to learn more of that here in spring on what Utah's schemes are going to be. But, I'm curious to see what it is. But I'm going to list here 3 potential starters for the linebacker position. Jonathan Hall, he was in that mix last year, produced. Let me add a caveat real quick to the linebackers. So linebacker play was really frustrating for Utah last year at many times. And some of that was largely because the defensive line just didn't live up to the expectations that they had for them. And so when they're, missing, their assignments and they're not tackling the people that they need to, that puts a lot of the onus on the linebackers to be in a position that maybe they weren't necessarily expecting. Now, they still have to perform, right? You still have to perform at that level to be able to be effective, but they were just asked to do a ton more than maybe was expected of them. And so, some of these grades, if you're watching on YouTube, and I'll talk about some of them here, is, from Pro Football Focus, aren't going to be favorable for a lot of these linebackers simply because they were having to do a lot and forced to fix a lot of what the defensive line was doing. And so some of that is going to be on them. Some of that's going to be on the defensive line. But, I still think this group as a whole is going to be pretty solid, but there's going to be room for improvement for sure. So looking at John O'Hall, once again, a little tangent there. John O'Hall, a really solid player who played all 13 games last year, had 67 tackles, 6 tackles for loss, 2.5 sacks, 4 pass breakups, 2 QB hurries, one interception, and one forced fumble. So really solid in terms of just overall production. He was everywhere, did a whole bunch of stuff, over 641 snaps, which is pretty crazy. Was able to produce well for Utah, but his grades, weren't the best, right? They were good. They were average, but for him to take that next step, he needs to produce at a little higher level. He's overall defensive grade from Pro Football Focus was a 70.2. If you remember from previous conversations I've had, getting closer to that 90 is more elite. In the 80s is great, good to great. 70s is just more average, right? Like it's more than average, but it's not doing anything, I would say, quote unquote, special. And so John O'Hall needs to take that next step for Utah to be effective. But I don't think they're in a world of hurt if he's not taking, demonstrative steps to be able to be a higher rated player. It just more limits kind of what Utah can do. But I think Hall, as he's still growing into this position, is going to continue to grow. And I think he's going to be one of the fixtures here at linebacker. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think he's a really solid asset for Utah, that can be effective. He's got veteran experience. He knows what he's doing, and I think that's going to help. Just curious how that scheme that Colton Swan's going to run will jive with these players. We'll see. I'm curious to see how that works in spring camp. So moving on to the next player, we'll go with Trey Reynolds. Trey Reynolds is a guy that has been with the program for a minute. He got some good minutes last year and really produced at a high level at times. Finished with 28 tackles, 6 tackles for loss, and 1.5 sacks, but wasn't really into the mix the full time. And so curious to see where he can take that next step. Is he going to be the bona fide starter? Is he going to be the first guy that comes off the sideline to help? We'll see. His grades are a little lower than John O'Hall's, but good pass rush grade, 73.2. Outside of that, coverage, tackling, a lot to be desired, but I think he was put in some positions that didn't help him. But I think there's a lot of expectations around Trey Reynolds and what he can do and kind of the next level that he can provide. But it's really going to be, it's going to really remain up to this spring as well as into fall of what that can mean for him. Let's move into Cyrus Polu, a younger player who really has a ton of upside. I think there's been a lot of conversation about who he can be and kind of the expectations that he can have for that position. I think he's a guy that there's a lot of excitement about him. He played in 13 games last year, a lot of it on special teams, had 14 tackles when he did play on defense. And his grades aren't fully great, but his tackling is 76.1, which is higher than the other two. So, if you can get him to be able to mix in with that, improve his overall defense, I think you've got a solid player. Grades aren't going to tell the whole story, right? But I think there's a lot of belief that Polu can be a really solid player for Utah, can really factor in, potentially be even one of the 2 starters there. But I'm excited to see him kind of take over this spring and what he's able to do. But this is a guy that I think, has a ton of upside. They've been excited about him from the time that they recruited him. And now it's a chance to be able to see what he can do on the field. I'm not going to list some of these players if you're watching on YouTube, I'm not going to put up graphics for all these other players that are backups or potential backups. It's a lot of my time. I just don't really want to do that. And some of them don't have a ton of stats yet. So backups here is going to be Elijah Ellis. Ellis is one of those guys that I think has that opportunity to be in the mix for a starting job as well, depending on what he can do. He had 114 snaps last year, 18 tackles, 3 tackles for loss, and 2 sacks. Solid player. His biggest thing, he grades high in Pro Football Focus in run defense, 75.2, and then in tackling had a 77 grade. So really solid production from him. I think he's on the verge of being there. Is it going to be Polu? Is it going to be Ellis? Who's going to be the player that emerges there? But right now I'm kind of tabbing him as the backup, but in kind of a starter capacity. So really curious to see what happens there. And then Brock Fono-Miana, he's a guy that came off his mission last year, played in 11 games, had 9 tackles, and registered a half tackle for loss in 47 snaps. And during that time, he was actually the highest graded tackler on the team in terms of the grade at an 83.6. So He's got that ability. Curious what that is. I mean, he was thrown into, backup roles and not fully into situations that is going to be starter quality, but I think he shows promise in what he's able to do, and I'm really curious to see what happens there. But I still think there's going to need to be some next steps for him to kind of move forward there and in what Utah wants from him. So, we'll see what happens there. And then Taysom Reed comes in as a JUCO. I expect him to be kind of in that mix as a backup as well. I just think it's going to be a tough climb initially to be able to get into a starter role. Maybe he really hones in on it in spring and then in fall, but I think he's got a little bit more of a road to go before he gets there. I expect him to kind of be more in the mix next year, but I think he can be a solid backup and be an asset for Utah, but it just remains to be seen. And then lastly, your deeper backups, the guys that probably aren't expected to produce immediately, are Preston Pitts and LeGarry Mitchell. These are true freshmen coming in this year. We'll see. Maybe one of them pops off and they become a standout performer, and we start to see what happens with them. But it remains to be seen. We just don't know, and I don't have anything to show that these two players can get starter role right now. All right, let's shift over to the secondary. Let's start with the corners, and sorry, I'm doing this one-man production, so I got to find my graphic for Scooby Davis, Elijah Davis. Been a starter for a couple years now for Utah. He's going to be tabbed in as a starter this year. Last year, he kind of had a little bit of a setback. I don't want to call it a setback, but he just didn't have the same production that was expected. But at the same time, he was on a unit that really just didn't allow a lot of passing yards. So the grades aren't going to look good for him, but he produced in a high enough level that really helped Utah. He was in for 627 snaps last year, just really solid asset that way. Had a 79.6 passer grade, NFL passer grade, so that's the opposite. The lower grade shows that he was a lockdown defender. Quarterbacks had a really hard time throwing at him. A really high grade means that he was just a sieve and everything went through him. He's in that middle range, so really solid overall, but has some improvement to make. His defensive grade was a 58.2, so not super high. There's going to need to be some improvement there, but I think he's the player that Utah still wants, and they're going to target as a guy that's going to be a solid asset. But there's going to need to be a step up, right? I think Sharif Shah is going to want to see more from him, but I don't think that he's a detriment to the program by any means. I think he's been a really solid asset to the program. I think he can make another step this year and be a real valuable player for that secondary, especially as they try to continue in their secondary in terms of limiting passing attempts, limiting deep threat plays. I think he's still a valuable asset that way. Now, there's a couple guys here that have transferred in. We're going to start with Elijah Reed. Elijah Reed comes in from Akron. And Akron is one of the worst programs in FBS. So take that with a grain of salt. But at the same time, he produced fairly well for Akron. In 12 games, he had 47 tackles, 2 tackles for loss, 1 sack, 4 pass breakups, and 1 forced fumble on 580 snaps. And so his NFL passer rating was a 58.9, so improved from Scooby Davis. Also had much higher grades, much more consistent player in what he was able to do, but he went up against different competition. That's not to say that this can't translate into the Big 12, but I want to see that consistently in the Big 12 to fully believe it. But I think Utah has a really solid player in Elijah Reed in what he does overall. I think he's got high grades in his run defense, pass defense, or pass rush. In coverage grades, he's got a 74.1. Overall defense is a 77.3. This is a guy that just can do a lot of different things, but we want to see more, right? I think you want to see more from him at this level and being able to produce, but I think he's a guy that if he can buy into Sharif Shah's system and what he does, this is going to be a very valuable asset for this Utah team and what they're able to do. Next is James Chenault. He comes from South Florida. This is a guy that had played in 9 games, had 32 tackles, 1 tackles for loss, and 3 pass breakups on 434 snaps. Side note here, like, let's be real. Tackles as a corner, we don't really need. So I'm just saying those just to kind of give you context. You really want a guy that can lock down, right? And you want to be able to have a guy that has good grades in pass coverage, whatever that may be. And so tackles, that just more means, somebody caught it or he had to be a help, you know, throw that out the window. It's more looking at kind of what his NFL passer rating is against him, as well as coverage grades. And for him, he had a 78.1. So similar to Scooby Davis, similar grades to Davis, a little higher overall. His coverage was a 65.1. So you want to see an improvement there. But I think with what Utah is able to do and the coaching staff, there's real potential that James Chenault is also another player that can be a valuable asset for Utah to be able to take that next step. And so for me, those are those 3 guys that I think have a real solid fixture on those starting roles. With Shaw, he likes to mix it in and out. So it's not just going to be 2 guys on the outside. It's not going to be 3 guys on the outside. There's going to be a lot of guys coming in and out. And so, these 3, in my opinion, are going to be the main fixtures, but that can change. There's a lot of players here that are going to be in the mix, and I'm really curious to see how that factors in. But I think you've got some solid corners that aren't necessarily going to be taking a step back from what Utah had last year. So curious to see there, but remains to be seen. Now, a little bit different here with the nickel. I'm going to throw the nickels in here as well. Nickel is Rock Caldwell, and I think he's going to be a very solid asset for Utah here in this position, assuming that they keep him here at nickel. Really dynamic player last year, 12 games. His total stats aren't going to look great in terms of what he did, but he had 9 tackles, 1 tackle for loss, 1 pass breakup, and 1 interception on 106 snaps. But the thing that I love the most here is that he had a 25.0 NFL passer rating against him. He was locked down. There was many times, especially late, where he was just a bona fide dog on the field, right? Where he came in there and you threw at him and it was not going to go well for you. And so I think, Rock, especially as he takes that next step where he gets more starter caliber minutes, I think is really going to emerge as a player for Utah in whatever capacity they need. Do they put him outside? Do they keep him at the nickel? I think he's the right player at nickel and can be a really solid asset there. But nickel is a very tough position, and so I'm curious to see how that pans out. With that said, though, his defensive grade from Pro Football Focus was an 82.7, and even more improved was his coverage grade of 86.5. So really solid player, limited snaps. Like I said, 100 snaps. But he's a player that I know that there's a lot of belief in, and I think there's going to be a lot of expectations placed on his shoulders to kind of be the guy to help there, and be a really solid asset there. Now, as backups, JC Hart, he's been with the program for 2 years, or he's going into his 2nd season now after transferring in. He's another the guy that's going to be in the mix there. I potentially threw him in as a corner as one of the 2 deep guys. Had 13 games last year, a lot of special teams. Had 6 tackles on 88 snaps. His grades were pretty low. I think there's a lot of things that he needs to improve on before he can fully get into starter role. But I'm going to say he's more of a fringe guy, right? I think he can have that potential if he takes that next step, but he's got to show it, and he hasn't shown it yet, at least at a consistent level. So there's that. And then other backups, you've got a lot of incoming guys that I think they can see the field because of that rotation and in what they're able to do, but I don't know how they're going to factor in. You get Earl Parker as a JUCO transfer. You get 2 players coming in as true freshmen in Major Hinchin and Dylan Waters. Curious to see what they provide. And then Nicholas Brown comes in from Lamar, probably play at the nickel, as kind of the backup for Rock Caldwell. So you've got them. And then your deep backups, Brandon Holmes, another JUCO guy who's not coming until fall, and that's why I'm putting him there. And then Isa Naliai, local product, true freshman, probably tabbed as a nickel player, but he doesn't come in until fall as well, and so we'll see what happens there. So that's looking to be your corners and nickelbacks. I think there's a really solid rotation there. It's not a position group that I think I'm too worried about because I think they're going to be pretty solid there. But, I would say they'll be really solid there too, especially because Sharif Shah does such a good job of being able to maximize these players, get the most out of them. But it's not just going to be a given, right? It has been a given for the last few years that Shaw's been able to just take guys and produce, but it's a new system, right? And you've got to continue to move forward with that. So really curious to see what Shaw can do with these players, who emerges from that room. But I think Utah's going to be in a really solid position there in what they're able to do. All right, let's shift over to the safeties and let's go to the one and only Rabbit Evans. Now, unfortunately for Rabbit, he got injured last year early on, and we didn't get to see anything from him. He was tapped to be the starter coming into the fall. He, was making tremendous strides in what Utah wanted from him. There was a lot of expectations and excitement about what he can be. We just didn't get to see it because he got injured for the entirety of the season, and so he's going to be once again tabbed as the starter here at safety. So if you're looking on YouTube, the graphic that I have here is from his 2024 Pro Football Focus grades. Really solid in coverage, like 79.2. And I think there was a lot of belief that he can improve on everything here. And so I think the expectation here is that, it's his to lose. And I think he's a good asset for Utah. He can, lay the blows. He's good in coverage. And I'm really excited to kind of see what can come from Rabbit because he's a really solid player that is going to be effective for Utah. And then the other starter that is expected is Jackson Benny. Now, Jackson Benny, if you remember his story, walk-on kid, local product, came in and just took his, got his shot and ran with it. I think coming into spring last year, there was some conversations about Jackson and what he could be, and then he just blew those by and then continued to do that in fall. Once he got his opportunity, he absolutely maximized it and took advantage. Quite honestly, I think he overshadowed Smith Snowden and became much more of a valuable asset than Snowden, which is crazy because Snowden was a really solid asset for Utah, but Jackson just did it all on offense, on defense, and was really great in coverage and being able to do what Utah wanted. There's still things that need to be fixed, right? He's not a finished product yet. His tackling was much to be desired, left much to be desired. His grade there was only a 49. And you saw it on the field at times where there was moments where he was just out of place. He wasn't getting the right leverage that he needed to and, missed out on certain things. But all in all, his coverage grades were great. This is a guy that played 676 snaps, excuse me, had 64 tackles, 4 tackles for loss, a half a sack, 5 pass breakups, 2 QB hits, 2 blocked kicks, 4 interceptions, and 1 touchdown off of that interception. So this is a guy that's a do-it-all type of guy, the perfect embodiment of what a safety can be at Utah. I think if he can take those next steps, you've got a real, true, valuable player in Jackson Benny who can do a ton of damage for this Utah defense. His coverage grade of an 81.5 was second on the team. This is a guy that just really excelled in all of what he was able to do, especially in just the 1 year that he really was put into primetime situations. So, really fascinated to see what he can provide. I don't know if we're going to see much of him on the offense anymore, but if you do, he's going to produce. He's a guy that can do it, but I think his leverage on the defensive side is so much more valuable, and I think you're going to see an even better season from him, or at least that's the expectations, right? I think him in that starting role is going to be a very valuable asset for Utah, be a lockdown guy. There were several games last year where, if he wasn't in the right position, the opposing team, if I remember right, even that Kansas State game, I could be wrong here. It's been a few months now that I'm thinking about this, but I believe there was a throw that was made into the end zone by Avery Johnson that Jackson Benny either picked off or broke up the pass. Had he not done that, it's a touchdown, and that miracle comeback doesn't happen. So Benny is a completely valuable asset for Utah, and I think that's going to continue moving forward. Lastly, of the starters here, I've got tabbed is Nate Ritchie. This is a guy that we've seen since 2020. I mean, it's been a long time. I think if you can get closer to that 2020 Nate Ritchie, it's gravy, right? The last few years just hasn't been that. He understands it, but I think there's things that, he's changed in his game that's allowing him to get there. The unfortunate part is he got injured again last year. So there's definitely things that don't help him in his game. Like his tackling hasn't been as great. There's several games that it just didn't work the way that he wanted to. but I don't know that he's that far off. But he has to make improvements, right? Like he has to make those next steps, or else it's just going to be, another player that is good that just hasn't maximized his potential that we saw early. I think him going on a mission completely changed everything for him, but I don't know that he can't get there. I think injuries have limited him. It hasn't helped him that way, but I don't know that he can't get there. Either way, he's a smart kid. He understands what he needs to do. It's just a matter of producing on the field. And I think Utah still has a valuable asset there. It's just a matter of kind of maximizing it when they need to. So that's my main starters there. Beyond that, your backups, Nate Tillman, he got into 11 games last year, 184 snaps, had 17 tackles, one tackle for loss, one sack. I think there's a lot of expectations placed on him on what he could be. I think he's going to be a valuable asset for Utah, just young, right? And I think he just needs those reps. We saw him get those a little bit last year, but I think you need to kind of see those next steps from him. And I'm really fascinated to kind of see his involvement because I think he can be another great asset. Does he, easily work himself into the 2D? Probably. I think he's definitely in that role. I just don't know that he can overtake Rabbit Evans or Jackson Benny. If one of them gets injured, maybe that forces him to get in there. But I think there's enough there that he's capable. I just want to see those next steps there. And then you've got two other players that we just don't know much about. Manny Fuller came in 2 years ago or last year as a true freshman. See what he gets. Marcus Wimberly, transfer from Oklahoma. There's a lot of expectations about him, but he's a younger player as well. Where do they factor in? What kind of roles will they have? And then your deep backups, as of right now, is Davis Andrews and Luke Bryant, two kids coming off of missions. How do they factor in? Trying to get your legs back after a mission is tough, but I think there's some expectations that Davis Andrews is the guy, right? Like he's a guy that they have a ton of belief in, that he can get in there and factor in. But what does it mean? How's it going to work as he develops, especially coming off that mission? So I think there's a lot of valuable pieces here on this team. This defensive side of the ball is going to be pretty stacked. But there's still a lot of questions that abound. And I don't know that we have all the pieces yet or the answers to it yet, but I think it's a really solid group of players that are going to be effective. It's just a matter of being able to put those pieces together, and we're going to get more of that in spring. So with that, we're going to sign off today. I hope I was able to provide a ton of insight for you, give you something. We went through everything. I'm going to try to not do that too much, try to break things down a little bit, even if I have to do a podcast on just a specific program. But wanted to recap a lot of that stuff and couldn't get some of it earlier. So that's it for today. Hope you're enjoying your quote unquote off season. There is no off season. It's always going, and hope you look forward to the spring experience. I'm looking forward to it. So with that, we're going to sign off today. Appreciate it. Hope you have a great day, and we will chat with you later.